My name is Andrew Mackenzie. I'm a member of the committee of the Clan Mackenzie Society of Scotland and the UK, and with my brother Kevin's help, I wrote the history of the Mackenzies entitled May We Be Britons. Kevin and I had been looking forward to staying on the island of Lewis this August for the planned international gathering that our chairman Donald had made such a brilliant job of organising. We had booked a room there at Lewes Castle in Stornoway, the former Seaforth Lodge, and home of William Dew Mackenzie, or Black William, 5th Earl and 2nd Jacobite Marquess of Seaforth, whose story and that of the Brazilian rodent, or coati, with whom he is depicted in this portrait, we are currently writing. Spanning 2 decades of Scotland's most colourful and turbulent history, this extraordinary tale, including intrigue, piracy and rebellion, takes us from Brazil across the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, and then on to Scotland and the Jacobite court in exile at Saint-Germain, where this portrait was painted. William is buried on the island at the Church of St Columba in Uí, just outside Stornoway. Kevin and my own ancestral roots can be traced back to the Macaulays of Lewis through Dame Margaret Macaulay, who married Murdo Mackenzie, Bishop of Murray and subsequently of Orkney. This is Margaret's tomb in Elgin Cathedral. The Macaulays hailed from Uig on the western seaboard of the island, from the windswept and bleak white sands of which the famous Lewis chessmen were unearthed in 1831. Kevin has suggested that the tradition of their burial in the early 17th century by the gillie of a Callum More Mackenzie would fit well with the idea that they were buried by Donald Cam Macaulay, the then Macaulay chief, to save them from a raid in the 16 teens by Colin Roy Mackenzie, or Red Colin, 1st Earl of Seaforth, whose appellation as chief would also have been More or Great. In the 18th century, Lewis drew the attention of another close family member, Bishop Murdo's great-grandson, Murdo Mackenzie of Groundwater in Orkney, who set new standards for hydrographic surveying in Britain by recognising the importance of a good land survey using triangulation as the foundation of accurate marine surveying. By 1785 it was claimed, "He who has Mackenzie's charts needs no pilot." From my copy of this chart of Lewis, drawn up in 1750, you can see that it was dedicated to Lord Fortrose, the clan chief who was later to have the earldom of Seaforth restored to him. And this chart, showing the southeast coast of the island, was dedicated to Sir Alexander Mackenzie of Gairloch, the head of our and Murdo's cadet branch of the family. And more recently, the island was to claim the affection of our uncle, Joseph Mackenzie, widely regarded to have been the father of modern Scottish photography. This is a photograph he took of an RAF friend of his on Tolster Head in 1948. Kevin and I were looking forward to returning to the Standing Stones at Callanish for the sunset visit that was planned as part of the international gathering this August, and I had intended to give a talk on the Mackenzies and Lewis for the event. When the trip was sadly cancelled, along with so much else this year, I had been asked to make a video instead. I had never produced a video before, but we are all having to get used to virtual communication in these unusual times. When producing our book on the Mackenzies, I managed to create a Mackenzie tartan Union Jack for the end papers, in order to symbolise my thesis that this family, from a supposedly remote Highland backwater played a significant role in British history. Hence the title May We Be Britons, which is a direct quote from the first Earl of Cromarty. Not having an Apple computer, which I believe is far better suited for this type of job, it took some effort to achieve these end papers as I had conceived them, but I was determined, and a friend of mine who's a graphic designer told me that he thought I'd taken Word to its absolute limits in achieving my goal. If a technophobe like me was capable of that, I thought I must be able to teach myself to do what so many amateurs appear to have done on YouTube. Here is my attempt, and I hope you enjoy it. This map of the northwest of Scotland shows the principal Mackenzie territories, which incorporated the Isle of Lewis and the vast majority of Ross and Cromarty, coloured in pink here, just like the British Empire used to be. The Mackenzies' relationship with the island of Lewis began at the end of the 16th century, as a consequence of their having taken the role of effectively being the Crown's chief agent in the north. Their conquest of Lewis, the one significant area of the Highlands and Islands that continued to trouble the government, happened after the Mackenzies had been drawn into the dispute over Lewis through the marriage of the chief, John Mackenzie of Killin's daughter, Janet, to Roderick MacLeod of Lewis. After a long drawn-out quarrel, which continued after the death of Roderick MacLeod in 1595, and culminated in the forfeiture of Lewis, when Roderick's son, Torquil Cononach, was denounced as a rebel in February 1597. Torquil relinquished his rights to the island to the Mackenzie chief. He also made over the mainland MacLeod lands of Assynt and Coigach to the Mackenzie chiefs. Colin Cam Mackenzie had thus been confirmed by the Crown as outright owner of Assynt in 1592, while his son Kenneth was confirmed owner of Coigach by January 1608, when he sold it to his brother Rory and Rory's wife Margaret MacLeod, daughter of Torquil Cononach. This was the renowned Rory More Mackenzie of Coigach, tutor of Kintail, whose descendants as Viscounts Tarbot and Earls of Cromarty were to become the most powerful cadet branch of the Mackenzies, and ultimately, at the end of the 20th century, chiefs of the clan. In Lewis, however, the trouble was perpetuated for longer, largely owing to King James VI's decision to civilise the island, as he saw it, by establishing a fishery there under a group of lowland entrepreneurs known as the Fife Adventurers. Having high hopes for the economic potential of the Western Isles, the king believed that the disorder caused by clan rivalry was depriving him of a much-needed revenue, and therefore sought deliberately to grant out territory to new and more loyal proprietors. A contract was drawn up in June 1598 with a company of 12 lowlanders who mostly came from Fife, under the leadership of the Duke of Lennox. After a succession of violent attacks by the locals, which obliterated the lowlanders' morale, in which Kenneth Mackenzie of Kintail's role was to play them off against the MacLeods, their venture was killed off for good, and the lowlanders left in exasperation, finally agreeing to selling their interest in Lewis to Kenneth, who had now been raised to the peerage with the title of Lord Mackenzie of Kintail. It was then during the minority of the first Lord Kintail's son, Colin, who succeeded in 1611, that his uncle and our present chief's ancestor, Roderick Mackenzie of Coigach, as tutor of Kintail, was to enhance to a significant degree the standing of the family. As effectively regent of the clan, it was Rory who put in order his nephew's estates, having been heavily indebted as a result of clan wars with MacDonald of Glengarry and the expenses incurred in holding Lewis. And it was above all this Rory who was instrumental in succeeding in finally securing the island of Lewis for the Mackenzies. In 1623, Colin's power and status were recognised when he was raised to the preeminent title of Earl of Seaforth after the Great Sea Loch on the east coast of the newly acquired island of Lewis. This is Loch Seaforth, from which the Mackenzie chiefs took the name of their earldom. After their developing a port at Stornoway, Lewis owed to the Mackenzies a peace and prosperity as was never before experienced in the history of the island, to quote one historian, and the dominance of the Mackenzie chiefs in the island became such that in a contemporary news sheet it was said of the third Earl of Seaforth that in Lewis he played Rex. The Mackenzie chiefs in the 17th century were known to have made a kind of progress, visiting their extensive territories in the manner of a medieval monarch. Thus, from the 14th of September 1614, when Rory secured possession of Lewis for his nephew, Lord Kintail, the principality remained in the permanent possession of the Mackenzies of Seaforth until 1844, when it was sold to Sir James Matheson of Jardine Matheson, the Far Eastern Trading Company. It was the first Earl of Seaforth, represented here in a posthumous portrait, now in Fortrose Town Hall, who rebuilt the castle of Stornoway on Lewis from its former ruin. The castle occupied a rocky island in Anchor Bay, just off the spur of land upon which Stornoway sits, offering a good degree of defence due to being separated from the town by a channel of water. The ruins of the castle remained in the harbour and are marked on old maps. This Ordnance Survey 6-inch to 1 mile map of 1851 shows the castle ruins as a single rectangular building. Although the exact form the castle took is unknown, it may have looked similar to the MacNeill's Kisimul Castle, which occupies a similar island location in Castle Bay on Barra, which is just to the south of Lewis. Following the death of the first Earl in 1633, the castle and lands of Lewis passed to his brother George. This is a rare later depiction of the second Earl, the only representation, in fact, that I have come across, taken from Edward Mackenzie's poem Caberfaid Gubrath, a lay of the Clan Kenneth, a rare little booklet published in Melbourne in Australia in 1907, in which the portrait is said to come from a proof print in the possession of the author. Despite a personal attachment to Charles I, George had initially opposed him as a Covenanter, but later he went over to the Royalist side. As a consequence of the severe financial straits that he found himself in owing to the Civil War, Earl George was to attempt entrenchment by retiring to Lewis, before then going into exile after which his creditors began legal proceedings to take possession of the island. When George died in 1651, he was succeeded by his son Kenneth, the third Earl of Seaforth, who used Stornoway Castle as a base for resisting Cromwell's troops. This is John Michael Wright's portrait of Kenneth More, third Earl of Seaforth, painted following the Restoration. Due to his loyalty to Charles II, the devastation that the second Earl had wished to avoid was completed when General Monk burned and plundered once more the western territories of the Mackenzies in 1654, and his lands were forfeited. This followed Kenneth's attempt to capture a Cromwellian ship in 1653 in resistance to the English occupation of the Isle of Lewis. In 1654, Stornoway Castle itself was destroyed by Colonel Cobbett's regiment of foot. There are suggestions that the castle may have been partially rebuilt and occupied for a time later, but this essentially seems to be the end of the history of Stornoway Castle. These two photographs, taken before 1882, show the remains of the castle which once stood on a rock in Stornoway Harbour, but nothing of it now remains, and its site has been incorporated into a modern pier. In the 18th century, the Mackenzie chief's seat in Stornoway was Seaforth Lodge, on the site of the present-day Lewes Castle, which was to be remodelled after being acquired by Sir James Matheson at the end of the 19th century. The lodge can be seen here as the white building in the left foreground, and here, in the background on the left, of James Barrett's late 18th century paintings of the bay at Stornoway. The Mackenzie clan chief to be most closely associated with Seaforth Lodge was William Dew Mackenzie, or Black William, the 5th Earl and 2nd Jacobite Marquess of Seaforth, the only chief to effectively make Lewis his home after he retired to the island, and as I explained in my introduction, he is buried here. We all, of course, commemorated last year William's brave exploits during the ill-fated campaign which culminated on the slopes of Glen Shiel. The Mackenzie chief's Principality of Lewis was the base from which the invasion on the mainland of Scotland was launched in 1719, and it was to Lewis that William retired following his pardon in 1726. My brother and I have been researching this individual in some detail. He began his career as a brave but sulky, petulant, and entitled youth, but his colourful life appears to have tamed him, and he proved himself an astute leader of his clan who put its interests first and restored its prospects. A fascinating insight into William's outlook can be gleaned from the fact that the Seaforths at this time were close family friends of the poet Alexander Pope. William's mother, Frances, the Dowager Countess of Seaforth, was a neighbour of Pope in Twickenham, and the poet's mother's closest friend, while William's twin sister Mary, Lady Carol, was adored by Pope. According to the celebrated poet, the Carols enjoyed a kind of rural idyll. He proclaimed them to be the most perfect model of domestic harmony. Throughout their lives, Pope and the Carols shared a temperate political philosophy that was suspicious of extremes and encouraged moderation. When he was only 12, Pope wrote his Ode on Solitude, which summed up his Arcadian philosophy of life. Blessed, who can unconcernedly find hours, days, and years slide soft away, in health of body, peace of mind, quiet by day. Sound sleep by night, study and ease, together mixed, sweet recreation, and innocence which most does please with meditation. Thus let me live, unseen, unknown, thus unlamented let me die, steal from the world, and not a stone tell where I lie. This measured philosophy, at this time of immense political upheaval, appears to have been ultimately shared by the one-time brave hero of Glen Shiel, who retired to quiet obscurity on Lewis. William is buried in St Columba's at Uy, near Eignish, on the shore of Lewis. Due to erosion, even William's burial place may now be lost to the sea, aptly fulfilling his friend Pope's prescription, steal from the world, and not a stone tell where I lie. This is St Columba's churchyard, just outside Stornoway. It's believed that Earl William's grave probably once lay below the pavement to the north of the church, and it is feared that his remains may now have been lost to the sea. However, let's hope that archaeological investigation may locate it yet. Although we know that he kept a yacht, which he named Caberfae, to take him across the Minch to Lewis when need arose, William's grandson, the last Earl of Seaforth, who was the owner of the islands during the later decades of the 18th century, and to whom we know Murdo the hydrographer's map was dedicated, did not appear to have visited the island much, spending more of his time in London or on the continent, where he perfected his role as a leading connoisseur of the arts and grand tourist par excellence, a friend of Mozart, Sir William and Emma Hamilton, the explorers Captain Cook and Sir Joseph Banks, and through them the exotic Tahitian visitor to London, Omai. The last Earl can be seen as a boy when he was known as the Little Milord in the portrait hanging behind me alongside his tutor, Bishop Murdo's great-nephew, Dr. James Mackenzie, whom he accompanied on the Grand Tour. And the last Earl is seen here, third from the left, together with his good friend, Sir Joseph Banks, who is on the far right, in Reynolds's portrait of the Society of Dilettanti, while his Low Country Bran estate in Easter Ross had been brought into good order. The extensive efforts on the part of Seaforth's factor, George Gillanders, to improve his hitherto neglected Lewis estate were obstructed by voluntary emigration and local opposition to the introduction of a flax spinning factory, intended, in Gillanders' words, to assist the poorest people and keep them in temper and spirit. It was only in the mid-1780s, however, when its new proprietor, the Earl's cousin Francis Humberston Mackenzie, the future Lord Seaforth, was playing a more peripheral role in national politics, that real attention focused on approving this estate of his. This is Francis in William Dyce's copy of Sir Thomas Lawrence's portrait. And this is Francis again in Sir Henry Raeburn's portrait of him. The 1780s were a time when Scottish landowners were becoming profoundly aware of both the need and the potential for reform. In Francis's West Coast estates and on Lewis, the population had risen by 50% in the last 35 years, but he was neither prepared to allow nor could afford the large-scale clearances that came later in the next century. By developing the fishing, kelp and linen industries, in which Lewis was to play a crucial part, Francis believed he could enjoy the best of the old world of heavy population and paternalism, and of the new world of efficient farming with larger rent rolls. He turned out to be fortunate in his timing, at least for a while, in that the rise in prices during the Napoleonic Wars accounted for an increase in annual income received from rents and the harvesting of kelp, the seaweed, which at that time was a valuable chemical resource. Important to this commercial development was the harbour at Stornoway, as seen here from above Seaforth Lodge, painted for Lord Seaforth by James Barrett in 1798. The true reckoning, however, came for the Seaforths when agricultural prices and consequently rents began to fall after Francis's death in 1815. The debts which Francis had built up as a necessary part of his strategy for cementing his political prestige could no longer be sustained. Owing to falling prices, the rental on the entire Seaforth estates had been drastically reduced by 1845. No longer able to support the interest of these debts on her diminished disposable income, the twice-widowed Mrs. Stuart Mackenzie, Francis's daughter and successor, shown here in a copy of Sir Thomas Lawrence's portrait, was compelled to sell one section after another of her inheritance. The remaining portion of Kintail was relinquished, then the fertile braes of Ross, the church lands of Shannonry, the barony of Pluscaden, and finally, in 1844, the great principality of Lewis itself was disposed of.